today we are privileged to have Dr. JPR Ochieng-Odero, a seasoned international development specialist who has been in the field for 36 years.
One of the sad things that I see in this country is that we have let go of excellent institutions. I miss our great leaders. I miss somebody whom I met severally, the late Mwalimu Julius Nyerere. They are heads of state in this continent of ours. If they speak, nobody listens. It's just because they don't, as the Gen Z says, they don't get it. I think one of the things that really encouraged me in the Gen Z is to see the quality of class.
A lot of corruption that has happened in the continent really is taking us back. Welcome to another episode of Development Perspectives Africa, where we discuss issues on international development, governance, policy issues around Africa. And today we are privileged to have Dr. JPR Ochieng-Odero, a seasoned international development specialist who has been in the field for 36 years. Today we shall be discussing about USAID, WHO, and climate financing. Does Africa need aid to develop? Let's find out. Welcome, Dr. Ari.
Thank you, Fiona. Yes, you say seasoned. Yes, I've been in the sector for quite some time. After finishing my bachelor's education in 1982, I got into research immediately, initially working on the African honeybee, being mentored by a very, very knowledgeable person, the late Professor Keria Kigatira, who was the head of the National Institute of Beekeeping in Nairobi. Shortly after that, of course, I joined the International Center for Insect Physiology and Ecology, ICIPE for short, which is also based here and which was founded by an African director, the late Professor Thomas Odhiambo. And almost immediately you can see that I have been a product of very good mentoring by people who were passionate about research and development and how it can inform development in Africa. I changed tact in around 2008, left research work as an active scientist and started working with funders, initially with the Consortium for National Health Research, which was funded by DFID of UK, IDRC of Canada, and the Wellcome Trust. And it was a 10-year program providing resources for health capacity strengthening in Kenya and Malawi. After 8 years, I then moved on and started working as a fund manager with PricewaterhouseCoopers for another DFID project known as the East Africa Research Fund, for a period of about 6 years. And more lately, I started working with the Evidence Fund, which is funded by UK's FCDO. So I've had a balance of both sides, being a researcher, but at the same time, also providing resources for research. I've been privileged to be a founding trustee of the National Research Fund of Kenya, from 2005 to 2021. And I was also a board member with the Commission for University Education, which is regulating universities in Kenya. So I have several perspectives in that. But I think I need to also tell you my other passion is that I love theater. I'm a dramatist. I write,
Yes.
direct. I'm also a blogger. I keep bees, and I love breeding dogs. So I'm an all-rounded person. Thank you.
Great to hear. Thank you so much. Before we started the show, we talked about bees and the importance of bees and how we definitely need to think about keeping bees in this area. I also started keeping bees a while ago, so I'll definitely talk to you more about to definitely ensure they are well taken care of for me to get the best honey. Thank you. So, as you've heard, Dr. JPR has vast experience in the international development sector, and it is quite important that we discuss these issues affecting Africa. Now, recently, I had an interview here with the WOFAC Executive Director, Dorothy Onyango, and we spoke about USAID suspension and how 95% of her staff have gone home. This has happened to very many organizations, not just in Kenya, but in Africa generally, when the USAID was suspended. What do you think African governments need to do right now? Because it was abrupt. How do we, as African governments, ensure that we properly plan? Because as things are, the USAID has been suspended. The US has exited WHO and also climate financing. How should our African governments actually plan from now henceforth on proper financing for their programs in their African countries?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. You say abrupt? Probably not.
Okay.
We saw this coming for quite some years. We didn't know it would be at the US, but I can tell you from my own perspective as a young researcher working at ISIPE, in around 1999, we had won a huge grant from the Austrian Development Corporation, ADC. And this was to do with cessate management in the Lake Basin area, especially Lambwe Valley. Just before we started implementing what was known as the lethal insect technique project in 2000, Austria underwent an election, and a new government came in, which started questioning the value of giving so much money to developing world. That funding for that program ended, and ISIPE had to lose a number of staff, and we've ISIPE never got back to the project. So it's been there, it's been coming. And the late Professor Odhiambo himself was very passionate about this issue. Having started ISIPE, having started the African Academy of Sciences, the Kenya National Academy of Sciences, he kept on seeing the nature of funding going down and getting harder and harder to convince and get funding for the development project. Actually, it was he himself who started thinking and convincing African governments to set up. The late Professor Odhiambo was very passionate about this issue because he could see that resources are not going to be, especially dependency on aid, is not going to be the solution. And he went around convincing African governments to set up an African funding facility known as the African Foundation for Research and Development. And he was able to convince 9 African states, including South Africa, then Zaire, and so forth. Those are the eras of when there was a President Mugabe in Zimbabwe, and got a lot of support from President Museveni and so forth. And the idea was that, is there a way we can sell our debt, the foreign debt that we have, and use the allocation of funds on that to develop our own program? So the financing facility was known as Debt for Science Swap. Extremely a good idea, but ahead of its time, and it didn't quite take off. So what I'm saying is that disruption in funding has been there. And there are people who have spoken about it and have tried to convince governments not to rely on foreign funding, but also find mechanisms to come up with initiatives that can fund our own development agenda as well as research. I mentioned to you that I worked for the Consortium for National Health Research. When the 3 funders, IDRC of Canada, Wellcome Trust of the UK, as well as DFID, gave funding to Kenya and Malawi, it was on the basis that we would develop our own funding facility within a period of 10 years. And so we got this funding. But the question year after year kept us being asked by donors is, where is your own financing facility? This was the precursor of how the National Research Fund of Kenya was developed. Unfortunately, after 10 years of funding to Kenya and Malawi, the donors decided, because there was no local financing facility, to pull back their funds. And so that consortium died. Luckily for us in Kenya, some of the funds were then used to start up the National Research Fund. So it is a lesson learned. It's a bit late, but it's not too late. We need to come up with strategies to raise our own local resources, to fund our priority programs, and basically welcome our development partners to support us in that initiative. But we need to own the funding of our programs. Thank you.
Thank you. Splendid. And thank you for this history of how we have tried to even set up our own funding, but it has been impossible. You sit in various boards, you have experience. What is the problem? Do we have political goodwill? How can we push this agenda more and more? Because as things are, a lot of aid has been, as things continue the way we are seeing, a lot of aid will be pulled back, you know. Do we need the president? Who needs to hear this? Who are the main people that really need to drive this agenda as the people in charge of the funding in these African governments?
It has to be the number one policymaker, and that is the head of state and the head of government. If the head of state is committed and wishes to see sustainable long-term funding, then you are likely to see some movement. You're indeed right. I sat on the National Research Fund of Kenya, and when in 2012, when Parliament decided to give to the National Research Fund 2% of the GDP, we really shouted that this was the direction to go. Unfortunately, the first grant that we got from government in 2015 was 3 billion, substantive money for research. We got into problems because the NRF was very new and did not have the absorptive capacity. Since then, believe you not, the budget has been going down and down every year. So we need to go back to that momentum and be able to give other resources there. But we need to go beyond that. We need to think out of the box and see how we can involve private sector. Because remember, the GDP is not only government funding. It's everything that we have for this country. So for African governments, they need to look for ways and means to look for investment. In fact, that is the way I look at it. Investment. And the big weakness that we have with our institutions, including the government, is that we are not good in resource mobilization. I, as sitting in the place of funder, have seen the poor proposals that we receive whenever there are calls for funding for various reasons. And I have been working with a few friends and initiatives. One of them is Sinovent. And I think I did mention to you that there is this particular manual that we are developing to help institutions, both firms and research institutions, to be able to have resource mobilization strategies. Part of this manual is ways of strengthening skills for our workers in these institutions to be able to write winning and convincing proposals. Because believe you me, it is all about being able to convince an investor that your idea is sound and that out of it are going to be outputs that will be able to drive development. Fiona, you know that the late Professor Odhiambo was a remarkable visionary research leader.
Absolutely.
He was able to come up with the idea of setting up ISIPE. He also set up the Kenya National Academy of Sciences, set up the African Academy of Sciences, and many other institutions. he was really passionate about making sure that we have the best trained minds and that our institutions are robust and able to deliver. I had an opportunity of asking the late Odhiambo, Professor, how is it that you are so successful in building institutions and getting resources for research? And Odhiambo laughed and said, actually, there's no magic. All it needs, it is a well thought out idea, delivered in a convincing proposal, and backed up with a track record of accomplishments, and you will get the resources. You need to understand that funders are there to give out funds which are really taxpayer money from those countries. They want to be able to help development across the world. We, on the other hand, the recipient countries, need to demonstrate that we are using those funds well and that they are being used for the reasons and intentions they were given for. Unfortunately, sometimes things go bad. Corruption is a major, major word, the dirty word in this business. And funders then pull back. Similarly, the voters in those taxpayers' countries where those funds are coming from are getting more vocal and wanting better services coming from the money that they give as tax. So it is their money, and they need to listen to also their taxpayers. So we need to turn the question around. What can we make our countries and our projects so attractive that they're willing to give these funds? And I think that is the direction that we have to go. We need to have better oversight management of the resources. That means that our boards must be composed of very qualified, well-purposed people. We need to make sure that our institutions are set up in such a way that they are able to deliver and not only be reliant. And this is part of the problems we have with our universities, because they're always waiting from the exchequer. And the reality of it, that type of funding is ending. So you need to look at the newer institutions that are coming up, which are doing extremely well. Look at Strathmore University itself. Has very little reliance on donors, but is able to drive on the agenda. And I think that is the direction we need to go.
Splendid. Thank you. You've really spoken about very many issues that are quite pertinent, from the university funding to, of course, the health sector, and also thinking about how the private sector can actually chime in and participate in ensuring that we see development happening. But Kenya and African governments suffer from poor institutions. You've spoken about corruption. I recently had a conversation with other professionals, and we talked about how aid really has been pilfered in African countries, and there's been a lot of corruption. And because this money, as you rightly said, is from taxpayers' money in the developed countries, it's becoming quite hard, because if there is no accountability, if we do not have institutions that will ensure that corruption is minimized or the corrupt people are really dealt with properly, then these issues will continue to face African governments, year in, year out. So what should we do in terms of engaging African governments to ensure that institutions are properly put in place, to ensure that any corrupt person is really dealt with properly, to stop other people who think that it's okay to pilfer these funds? And also, let's talk about the private sector. Recently, the Nairobi hospital is being involved, has been in the news for the wrong reasons. You see, there's infighting in the board. There's a lot of issues in the private. It's a private sector entity. How do we ensure that we see less of this and proper management to ensure that we drive this agenda forward?
Fiona, difficult but still doable. The reality is that boards need to be properly constituted, need to be properly empowered, and that you ensure you have the right people oversighting. And then we need to punish those that are rogues and that are spoiling these institutions that are meant to be delivering results for the welfare of our people. So they need to get the punishment they deserve. They cannot afford to be let loose. But the solutions are at several levels. I think in Kenya, for instance, the county governments need to be more accountable and also need to be active in sourcing for resources for development. At the national level, we need a spirited effort by the government as well as other players in the private sector to be sure that we have appropriate programs that we are channeling funds to and that we are seeing results. But it goes also to the regional level, to the East African community, and more importantly to the African Union. The African Academy of Sciences, some 5 years ago, negotiated a very interesting project, which was basically to come up with a resourcing instrument, very much like what Odhiambo created with the African Foundation for Research and Development. And what that was going to do was that you would get head of state commitment at the AU level to be able to agree on an allocation of funding for research and development, which all the African heads of states who are members of AU would commit to. And there would also be a capacity strengthening initiative. Unfortunately, for whatever reason happened, that project did not take off. But we need a multiple level acting. And there are excellent examples in the continent. You go and look at the National Research Fund of South Africa. It is the source of funding for all the universities, for the whole of the research and development machinery in South Africa, and attracts massive resources globally. So it is in India, so it is in Brazil, and across the whole world. Why don't we have similar mechanisms in Kenya? I go back, head of state commitment. We are privileged in this country, in Kenya, at the moment, to have a PhD level head of state who should be able to understand the research question. By the way, he's very passionate about innovation. And you must have remembered that it is just towards the end of last year that President Ruto announced that the Kenya Innovation Agency is going to be moved to his office. What that means is that you're getting a commitment, because innovation does not lie entirely across the public. This is the one area that the youth can play their part. And if you have been listening to the Gen Z movement and youth across the world, and especially in Africa, they are saying they want to be active in answering the questions for development in our continent. So that's really where we should be able to play. But the head of state commitment is extremely important. I'll just give you one example. General Obasanjo, the former head of state of Nigeria, he was a very good friend to the late Professor Odhiambo. And the African Academy of Sciences was going through a financing crisis. General Obasanjo, as head of state, gave $5 million to the African Academy of Sciences as an endowment fund. That money was meant to be used, the proceeds of investment of that money was meant to help Academy deliver its programs. Sadly, in the recent past, there were attempts at the management level to put their fingers into that endowment fund. And it was the resistance of the scientists across Africa that changed that direction. So you can see, even with very good intentions, our nature, the nature in us to enrich ourselves gets sometimes in the way. But there are good examples, and that's the way we should go.
Thank you. Lovely. Again, thank you again for this, diverse knowledge and experience that you're bringing on board, telling us examples of South Africa, India, and other countries that are actually pulling together their resources to ensure less dependency on aid for their survival and implementation of innovations in their countries. Now, actually, African Academy of Sciences was quite big quite a while, but then there was a while back when things actually started going down south. So I don't know how it is currently. Is it still coming up and being one of the most revered institutions in Africa as far as funding for the higher levels in education is concerned?
Oh yes. The African Academy of Sciences really went through a crunch.
Yes.
And again, it is kudos that in fact, it was so bad that there were attempts to move the headquarters of the African Academy of Sciences from Nairobi to elsewhere. But the members of the academy, which are eminent scientists in Africa, were able to bring in a governing council, which is more directional, and their fundraising capacity has gone back. Their profile is coming back up. And you need probably bodies like that, so that national interests do not override continental interests. And the academy is a very good example. But yes, things are shining and looking up for the academy.
Yeah, thank you. So, of course, you started off talking about how US, the superpower that really funds a lot of programs in Africa, started off by saying there's a suspension of USAID. So, what does it mean? This is a hot topic right now, where we're talking about what is the way forward. For example, communicable diseases like HIV and AIDS. Africa is suffering. What's the way forward? Because after the suspension of USAID, a lot of these African governments really depended on this money to do any work. A lot of work. 50% and above of these healthcare initiatives in Africa depended on USAID. What's the way forward?
Fiona, that's again an excellent question. I sit on the board of the International Center for Reproductive Health. And in a board meeting that we held about 2 weeks ago, we were informed by management that nearly 30% of the funding for the organization that came from USAID has been suspended. So Fiona, this is an issue for all the governance structures of these institutions. The reality of it, some institutions are going to collapse. Just as we saw when COVID came, there's some business that never survived thereafter. So that's the nature of things. Those who are creative enough, those who have the emotional intelligence, who have the energy, who are able to think out of the box, are going to come up with solutions. And I think the most important is for us to think long-term funding. There was a time in this country when we had large plantations of sisal. And as you know, synthetic fiber then came in. And farmers started pulling out, uprooting the sisal from their farms. The smart question for us to have asked was, what else can we use sisal for? And then put a pot of money for research, for Kenyans to be able to answer that question. And that way, probably we would continue growing sisal, and we would continue. So sometimes it's just asking the smart question. This USAID move gives us an opportunity of coalescing together and asking smart questions. Let's not miss this opportunity. Let's get our think tanks, let's get our intelligentsia, our academics and researchers to sit together and creatively come up with a solution. You'd be surprised if you went back to Trump with a long-lasting solution, implementable over several stages, winning ourselves with that type of funding. You will get support from all over. You'll get support from Japan, you'll get support from UK, you'll get support from the US and other places. What we are doing at the moment is that we are looking for other sources. So you'll see discussions of, should we go to China? I don't think that's the answer. The answer is getting another way for sustaining. That is the same question when you need to think about our university funding. Why is it that a university such as the University of Cape Town is such an excellent institution, has top-notch researchers, has patents, gets in money from funders day in, day out, and our universities are struggling. So, and you can see the standards are starting to fall. The University of Nairobi itself is losing its pinnacle, and newer universities are coming in. By the way, some of the newer universities are coming are very creative. I want to give you one. You go watch Tomboya University. It is attracting private sector money in building infrastructure, in shoring up its programs, and so forth. So we just need to think differently and have capable, motivated research leaders.
Thank you. as they always say that whenever an incident happens, whenever a disaster strikes, that's when people actually think about innovative ways to survive, because it's either survival or death. Like they say, even in academia, it's you either publish or perish. Now, I went to the University of Nairobi, very proud University of Nairobi, but recently, of course, we've seen a lot of challenges happening. And not just only in the University of Nairobi, we have more university going down. And we have other universities, major universities in Kenya that have really uplifted the name of Kenya, because in Africa, they speak about the countries that are doing very well academically. Kenya is on top, We have South Africa, we have Egypt, we have Rwanda, we have Kenya amongst the top countries that are doing very well in terms of their education systems. Now, I've given examples like Tom Mboya, and you also, work at Strathmore University, which is actually doing very well and coming up as one of the universities to look at, in Africa. What is Strathmore doing right? And what can other universities actually learn from Strathmore way of properly planning for their resources and just generally education in Africa?
That is a question that I probably don't even have the answer, but I know part of the answer. When I joined Strathmore, the then DVC, the current DVC for Research and Innovation, Professor Da Silva, charged me with the responsibility of doing a university-wide audit of its research culture. And that audit revealed that there are certain practices that can be done better. There are certain things that they do right, but they could be done better. His question was exactly the question I've posed. He wanted the Strathmore University to have a publishing record similar to that of the University of Cape Town. He wanted us, Strathmore University, to have patents and so forth, and attract resources. They are on the way. But if you go to Strathmore, the first thing that strikes you, first of all, the compound is very clean. The facilities are clean, the toilets are very clean. But the young people who are there, both lecturers and students, are very well dressed. In fact, their dressing is, you can't believe it. It's like being in a university anywhere in the world. Do you know, show me a lazy person, and I'll show you a person who does not make their bed. Discipline always shapes people. You wake up early, you are motivated to go to work, you are able to produce results, you are challenged. But when things are easy, then mediocrity steps in.
Very true.
And I think this is what we need to go across. And I see that in the Tom Mboya University. I think in the case of Tom Mboya University, it's even much more interesting in the sense it's a public university. But it bears a name of somebody who was extremely important in this country.
Yeah.
For the history of liberation of this country, but as well as in the first government. So they are mutually reinforcing each other. So I think that is the type of things that we want. We need proper standards. We want to see the Commission of University Education becoming stricter in its inspection of these institutions. We want to see the National Commission for Science and Technology and Innovation, NACOSTI, becoming much more strict in terms of inspection of and licensing research in this country. We want to see the ethical review boards living up to their expectation. And I applaud the recent appointment of Professor Abdul Razak Shaukat back as a PS for research and development, because he was at the helm of NACOSTI when he changed from the National Council to the National Commission for Science and Technology. And he knows the purpose of that institution in terms of advising government. So I think we have the brain power and we have motivated people. Let us ensure that we get the right people to drive our institutions. Thank you.
Thank you. You spoke about Obasanjo and how he brought in the funding to the African Academy of Sciences. I'm just wondering if, for example, African governments can come together, like you say, the role of the African Union, come together and say, this is what we need to do for African, research and reduce aid dependency. But there, if you look at, for example, entities like the East African Community, there's a lot of issues, and countries don't really trust each other. How do we ensure that African governments work together? Because number one, there's lack of trust in some entities, where other African countries will feel that some countries are bulldozing others, and some other countries are more corrupt than others. How do we put one plus one together and ensure that African governments, number one, trust each other, for them to even try and put and speak in one voice as regards aid dependency in Africa?
Yeah, another huge question. You know, the Pan-African dream of people like Kwame Nkrumah was to see one Africa. They had come out of a very bitter experience of being colonized. And here was an opportunity to think bigger than each of the different small countries. We are still caught up in that trap. But you've heard of the saying, I think it is Lincoln or somebody who said it. If we don't hang together, we will be hanged separately. It's an issue of survival. The reality of that some of our states are steeped up in traditions and are resisting modernity. When COVID came, it does not select where it hits. So you need a voice across Africa. When HIV came, it did not select, it selected the whole world, and so forth. So the reality of it is that these institutions that are regional, that are development oriented, must give us answers for us to be able to collectively speak together. Otherwise, we will be hung separately and we will not survive. So it's an issue of being able to read the writing on the wall, and that what the USAID funding has now managed to help us. And by the way, if you look at, there was an interesting article that somebody put on Twitter about early this week. And I think it shows there are about 30 more countries that have cut it, including UK, the Netherlands, and so forth. Because domestically, they feel that their money is needed in their countries. And remember, USAID was a good catalyst to make other funders respond to development process, because they gave what was called something like basket funding. When they pulled out, a lot of funders feel they will be isolated. Their funding will not make the type of catalytic change development-wise. And so those funds should be used better elsewhere. And our response must be an African response, not only a Kenyan response. Because you have problems, like, for example, I am working on a project currently looking at the desert locust problem. Now, you know very well that Kenya is not a breeding country for the desert locust. It breeds in places like Yemen, Sudan, and so forth. But when the locusts gregarize and swarm, they affect the whole countries in the region. So the proper response to the desert locusts was to form a regional organization, the Desert Locust Control Organization for East Africa. In other words, one country could not solve the problem. And there are many transboundary pests and diseases that are the same. So we need a regional African response.
Thank you. We either work together or we get hanged separately. Very well said. Now, I actually looking at some development aid reductions 2025, like you've said. So the US has cut about 60 billion and 90%, 60 billion, cut on aid, and 90% was USAID contracts, which has halted global development and humanitarian programs. Germany has cut 1.773 million pounds in terms of aid, which was due to budget constraints, including nearly 2 billion euros in 2025 has been slashed. I see Finland reduced 25% of its aid to African countries on their official development assistance budget. between 2024 and 2027, Canada has reduced its 2023 foreign budget by 15%, and in February 2025, cuts it's actually 1.3 billion that was cut. Belgium 25% reduced. Italy 0.2 billion has been cut. France $1 billion. Switzerland $282 million. Sweden 291, and European Union 2 billion. That means if we really don't plan as African governments, then we are doomed. Now, for a long time, it has been, does Africa really need aid to develop? What do we do now that, as things are, Africa needs to rely inwardly on its resources, manage its resources properly, and not depend on aid, because in the next 10 years, there'll be no aid in Africa.
Oh, yeah. The story is getting worse.
Yeah.
It's actually not going to get better. Aid, as you know it, is on its way out. We are going to get another form of assistance, but not donor funding, donor aid, as we traditionally knew it. And funders are really asking African countries and countries over the world to start to be more creative. I think there's no any other solution. That is a good. Let me tell you something that will fascinate you. Around the 1970s, when Professor Odhiambo was building up ISIPE, Professor Odhiambo would write a letter to then Ken Prewitt, who was the president of the Rockefeller. And in that letter, put a case for some assistance to ISIPE, either for building laboratories or for equipment, and also say how much money was required. And would you believe it? Kenneth Prewitt's response to Odhiambo would be a letter with a check in the name of Odhiambo. And that is how funding was. Now, of course, it's complicated. You have to go to donor negotiations. You need to have well-written proposals and so forth. So, in the period of my own lifetime, I've been seeing this change. And as I say, it's going to get worse. Yep.
Thank you. I don't know. It's really becoming difficult, and like we've said, there's a lot of also corruption, and in Kenya especially, I remember recently during the Gen Z protests, the young people are very angry because of the political class that was showcasing, its wealth on social media. So we have member of parliament showcasing their latest cars on social media, their latest watches that cost billions, in terms of everything that put together of these politicians on social media showcasing their wealth was really not a good show. And Gen Zs went to the streets and to protest what these politicians were doing. And still, Africa is wealthy. We have a lot of resources in Africa, but corruption really is the problem. How do we ensure that really we stop this pilferage of resources in our countries for the betterment of our people, and really plan, even with the little resources, to really ensure we don't depend on aid anymore?
You need a Damascus moment. And for this country, we had a president who made sure things worked. We had the late Mwai Kibaki.
Yes.
And Mwai Kibaki managed to remove us from a brink of collapse and bring us to a level where we were feeling so good of ourselves, we were managing the economy. The feel-good factor was across the nation. We were winning in cricket. We had outstanding success in athletics. We were winning in rugby and so forth. The Gopa DJ, music was all over, booming. And for the first time, our Kenyan musicians, could show off their music against the Tanzanians and so forth. It is the national fabric. And we cannot get to an apathy anymore. As I say, policymaker number one, we voted you in, you need to show us results. And you need to show us a direction. The Damascus moment has arrived.
Now, you've spoken about the health sector, WHO and USAID funding. and the private sector, really the importance of the private sector coming into these issues to just help these countries develop. Of course, the private sector is a very important entity, but how does the private sector come into a space where there's a lot of corruption? How does, how do we convince the private sector that it is important for them to be players in this game, for us to really move forward as a nation and even as a continent?
I think you have the answer right there. The private sector will not invest in anything that is, first of all, very costly for their doing their business. They will look for other places to go. And you have had instances of companies that have left this country and gone to Tanzania, some to Uganda, many to Rwanda, and other places. There are organizations that are thinking of, yes, continuing working in Kenya, but not being headquartered in Kenya. The cost of doing business is extremely hard here for private sector institutions. This has to be made easier so that they can use their money for development. Remember, we are all in it together, and the private sector wants to make profit and grow. We've had some remarkable innovations in this country. The M-Pesa one is a miracle. It's being copied all over the world. We want to see more and more of that. And more importantly, have a framework whereby our youth can be involved, can give the innovations and creative talent and their skills, and can feel part owners of the country. The Kenyatta government came up with something called Mwongozo, which is an advisory to the state corporations in terms of governance. And I remember listening to one presenter from the state corporation that is pushing that agenda, saying that they have looked at institutions that are successful, public institutions that are successful. And there are some 10 common elements. One of the most common elements in them that is common in these institutions is the workforce feel they own the institution. Extremely important. You can only contribute to something that is of value to you. That's why you wake up hard and go and work to make sure your children go to school. But if it is not worth and not worthy to you, you're not going to invest in it. And this is the reality of it. So the private sector needs to receive those inducements that will make them invest. And that is how the GDP grows. And that is why the allocation to important sectors such as the National Research Fund will grow. That is the relationship that we need to see.
Talking about health, let's talk about climate change. Of course, Africa suffers the most when it comes to climate emissions, despite it being the least emitter compared to the developed countries. And of course, recently still, the US pulled out and said we are not going to fund anything climate change, and we have a lot of deniers coming from the US. So what should we do as people who are interested in climate change and climate conversations to keep the conversations going? And how will this affect now, negotiations, especially for the African governments?
I think we're already seeing a direction in that regard, because this is again is a world phenomenon. Climate change is happening; it's a reality. It is hitting hard the poorer countries. It is hitting hard the developing world. It's hitting hard Africa. And we now need to use our voting power in the UN and in other spaces to sell our agenda. It comes back to the question about how do we make sure that the African Union plays its game as a team. We need to have points and actions that we stand to and negotiate on it, and also be able to give solutions which are from the developing world. That's I think that is the only way we are going to deal with it. The northern world, the US and places like that, developed because of the wealth of Africa. The slave trade movement enriched those parts of the world. They have a moral responsibility not to do it again by exporting their decay in terms of carbon emissions and so forth to the detriment of the African nations. And so our institutions, our negotiating power should be bigger. You'll be interested to know that the Evidence Fund, which is funded by UK government's FCDO, made a call in Eastern Africa for an agenda on climate change. What would be the issues we face? What should we do? And the results of those, I think the results have come out. There is a report on it. But at the gist of it is an insistence on us taking a common position and using that common position to bargain for our advantage.
Actually, the African Union has designated 2025 as the year of reparation, focusing on justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations to address lasting effects of colonialism, slavery, and systemic discrimination, and advocate for justice, equity, and redress. And you've spoken very well, saying that, a lot of these European countries actually developed due to the slavery, and Africa needs reparation. But how do we go about these issues? Because, of course, we're talking about how do we ensure that these governments and, of course, our partners really see the need to support some of these issues, because climate change continues to affect us every day. And, how might this funding now affect a lot of research and scientists who really rely largely on this funding for their innovative work to actually proceed and not, come to an abrupt stop?
An interesting question. Again, we are one world. It is no one section of that world that can develop and the others do not develop. A lot of us, I included, trained in the West. I went to New Zealand. That's where I did my PhD. A lot of people have trained in the UK, people have trained in Canada and the US and so forth. So there is a responsibility to make sure that there is capacity built. We are seeing more and more commonality in terms of exchange of human resources, but also skills and so forth. I miss our great leaders. I miss somebody whom I met severally, the late Mwalimu Julius Nyerere. Very courageous. Faced the hard questions without blinking. Without Nyerere, probably South Africa would not be independent. I miss Mandela because President Mandela could see the good in Libya and see the good in Palestine and see the bad in Israel and so forth. You need more and more courageous people of that type in our leadership, and not people who are just puppets, people who want to be there forever, are not responsive to the people they govern. Because people like Nyerere transcended Africa. If Nyerere woke up and spoke, the whole world listened. When Mandela spoke, the whole world listened. When Obasanjo speaks, the whole world listens. There are heads of state in this continent of ours. If they speak, nobody listens. It's just because they don't, as the Gen Z says, they don't get it.
They don't embody what Africanism is all about, and that's why actually people really rarely even listen to what they speak about. So yeah, that's very true. We actually need more leaders who are for Africa and for Africans, and what really needs to ensure that Africa feels at home with its leaders, great leaders in place. Do we have hope in Kenya?
I think there's hope. I think one of the things that really encouraged me in the Gen Z is to see the quality of class. Listen to the debates that we have in our televisions in the morning and in the talk shows. Extremely interesting, articulate people. But yet, we don't, people of my age and beyond, don't want to seize that power to the youth. People like Tomboya got where they were at a very young age.
Yes.
Yes. You have had people like Kennedy who ruled and have made changes. America went to the moon because of Kennedy's vision and so forth. So again, we need to trust our people, our young people. We need to be more inclusive. Let's use our youth. Let's use the people who are living with disability. Let's use the gender disparity. You know, I trained in India, and one of the most interesting thing about India is that there are so many divisionary things about it. They have so many languages. They have the caste system.
Yeah.
But when India moves as one. If you go to restaurants in India, you'll find a Sikh restaurant, you'll find a Patel-run restaurant. That diversity does not mean that they break apart. It actually makes them richer and more engaging. I think that's what we should be looking. So we should not be looking for these ethical divisions, tribalisms. Probably that's where our strength is, and we need to capitalize on that to move us forward.
I'll ask you a question, which is not a final one yet, but seeing how I have said it's abrupt, but you're saying it's not abrupt, the USAID, the moving out of WHO, and also the climate financing. Considering the link between climate research, public health, what risks might African communities face in advancement if climate science is curtailed? Because we speak about I think we've really spoken about the macro level and not really the micro level, because as things have happened at the macro level, it's going to trickle down to the communities. What should African governments do to ensure that communities do not suffer what this really has happened in terms of aid cuts, recently?
I think we need to relook at our priorities. One of the sad things that I see in this country is that we have let go of excellent institutions. I started my college training at the Medical Training Center here at Kenyatta National Hospital. And in those days, towards the end of the 70s, we would see TB-resistant patients from as far as Egypt and elsewhere being brought to Kenyatta Hospital for treatment. I lived a time when agriculture was huge at Egerton. The whole of that area was thriving. And many students would come from all over Africa to be trained in Egerton. I lived in a time when Utalii College was the premier training institutions for matters, food, and the hospitality industry. So these institutions, Egerton, the MTC as I knew it, Utalii College, and so forth, have been, for lack of a better word, disempowered. You now go to Egerton to train, to read literature. You go to other places. We need to help our communities. We need centers of excellence. The challenges that we are witnessing now, due to climate change, due to other things that are happening, due to the one village concept and so forth, need some smart thinking. We have bacteria-resistant drug resistant, which are resistant to drugs. We are having major transboundary problems. What we used to know as highland malaria has now spread. For the first time, I mentioned that the desert locust does not breed here. But if you remember the 2020 invasion of the desert locust, for the first time, when the locusts came from Ethiopia and beyond and came to Kenya, they raised a second generation. In other words, they laid eggs in our sandy rivers. And that the resultant population crossed over to Uganda and crossed back to Sudan. These are challenges which we've never seen before. And with something like the desert locust, it's such a big pest that no one person has a solution, no one farmer has the solution to it. It needs a generic response. So I think we need to go back to the drawing board and look at our priorities, look at the skills that we're training in our colleges and universities, deal with the new crisis. You know very well that we have a mental health issue. In our universities, students are committing suicide. For goodness sake, we didn't raise our children, take them to university to die. We need to have a big solution. You know very well that in this country we've had femicide. Women are being killed. I've never heard of this anywhere. Yeah. So what is the solution?
Actually.
So you saw something called Shakahola massacre. One of the worst and very interesting massacres we have seen. You saw the floods of last year and so forth. I can go on and on. We need young minds, fresh directions, and we need the resources. Our institutions must be empowered in resource mobilization to get the resources to answer the questions that are bedeviling us. And more importantly, be diagnostic and look into the future and predict. Monkeypox is around. When is the next pandemic coming? We should be thinking about those issues. And we should have institutions that can prepare us for such issues.
Very well said. Now, final word. When it comes to speaking with one voice, Africa has the African Union, but still, I'm not so sure African Union speaks with one voice for Africans. How do we ensure that, for example, you have other countries that actually give money to the African Union, other countries do not submit their funds to the African Union? Actually, there's a lot of challenges that African Union is facing, but having worked across Africa, what do you think should be done to ensure that Africa speaks with one voice in terms of climate change during the COPs and other big conferences, that Africa has one voice in climate change, in health, and every development aspect of Africa? How does Africa speak with one voice?
Yeah, very well said, Fiona. That is really true. But you know, if you don't have the money, then you are not felt. If Africa was giving money to its institutions, if Africa was demonstrating it is answering the health challenges, the climate issues, and so forth, by domestically financing, they would be listened to. But a beggar does not change the direction of the dialogue. I can't come to your house and ask for a meal and then ask you to change things in your house. It doesn't work that way. So the reality of it is that we will be listened to when we show. If Nyerere and Tanzania, a relatively poor country, could stand up to the domination and the apartheid in South Africa, to the war in Mozambique, and give basis to Frelimo and other fighting powers, including the ANC and so forth, to liberate their own country. It needs that level of commitment. And that is why Nyerere could be listened to. It is not a wonder he was called Mwalimu. So we need, as I say, put your money where your mouth is. We will listen to you. And you will be able to move the dialogue forward and lobby more active.
Thank you very much. There you have it. Africa does not need aid to develop. We need partnerships to ensure that we are actually at a safe space as a continent and also as a country in Kenya. A lot of corruption that has happened in the continent really is taking us back 2 years, and ensuring that the development that has happened over the years is really drained, and Africa does not move forward. Thank you very much, Dr. JPR. That has really been insightful. 36 years of experience in international development. This has really been insightful, and we really hope that the African governments can listen and hear what the policymakers are saying, that we need to properly plan for our institutions. We need to properly plan for the resources in our countries to ensure that our people, our communities do not suffer when the developed countries decide to stop and freeze funding for Africa. Thank you very much. Until next time, bye-bye.